Hello, welcome to week 5 of Data Engineering Zoomcamp, and in this week we will talk about batch processing. I want to quickly first talk about what exactly we are going to cover in this week. So we will first talk what batch processing is, and one of the tools that we can use for batch processing is Spark, and we will spend most of the time this week talking about Spark. So we will talk what Spark is, why do we need it, and then we will install Spark on Linux. So I will use a virtual machine from Google Cloud platform, and I will show you how to install Spark there. After that, we will take a first look at Spark. We will use PySpark for that, meaning we will use Python, we will not use Scala, and we will then look at different features of Spark, like data frames, SQL, how we do joins in Spark, and then we will talk about a relatively old concept from Spark called RDDs. This is, I think, it's resilient distributed datasets. So what they are, what is the difference between data frames and RDDs. We will spend some time talking about internals and then how we can use Docker to run Spark jobs. All that we will do locally, but then at the end, the last 2 lessons, we will talk about deploying, actually going to the cloud and then running Spark jobs there and then connecting this to a data warehouse. So that's roughly the plan for the week. Let's start with introduction to batch processing. So, okay, what is batch processing? Before I answer that, I want to talk about different types of processing data. There are multiple ways of processing data. One is called batch, and the other one is called streaming. So this week we will actually focus on this, and next week, week 6, we will spend time talking about streaming. Let me give you a little bit of intuition what is batch and what is streaming. So batch is, let's say you have a database, and this is our taxi trips data set, and then we have some data for January 15th, for example. Then we take the entire data set, all the data we have for January 15th, and then there is one single job that takes all this data for January 15th, and then it produces something else, some other data set. So this particular job reads the data for the entire day from 00 January 15th to 23:59 January 15th, takes all the data and it processes, does something. Then the other thing, streaming one, is imagine we are in New York, that's me, and I want to hire a taxi. So I wave and then a taxi driver sees me. It's yellow taxi. So they see me, they come, so I hop on a ride, and then the driver, they probably have a mobile phone or some device. This device sends an event saying that ride starts, and then some meta information about this ride. And then this event is sent to a data stream, and then there is something that is processing data from this stream, like a processor. And then it puts the processed data to another data stream. This happens on the fly. So the moment I hop in a taxi, the device inside the taxi sends an event, and then this thing processes this event and puts the result somewhere in real time. So this week we will not talk about this. This is again week 6. And this week we will focus on things that process huge chunks of data in one go. So we have batch jobs that run weekly. They process data for the entire week. Daily is probably the most common. So you accumulate some data for the entire day. And once the day is over, you process everything you collected from me yesterday. That's a batch job. Then hourly, pretty common. And then for batch jobs, yeah, you can go to smaller granularity, 3 times per hour, or I don't know, maybe every 5 minutes. But these are less typical. So I think the most typical ones are daily and hourly, meaning that once an hour is over, you process everything that happened in the previous hour, and the same with the day. And then the technologies that we use for these kind of jobs are often Python scripts. So remember the data pipeline we wrote in week 1. So it was about getting a CSV file and then ingesting this to a database. This was a batch script, and we used Python to do this. And we ran it with monthly intervals. So for each month, we would execute the script. Then SQL is pretty common. So in SQL, you can define all these transformations. And this is what we saw in week 4, using SQL to transform data. So all these things are also batch jobs because we get a huge chunk of data and we process it in one go. And SQL is pretty popular for that because it's convenient. People know it. And then This is something we will cover in this week. Spark. So this is a pretty popular technology for batch jobs. And then there are others like Flink and others. And maybe it's worth mentioning, so these Python scripts can be run anywhere. We can run them in Kubernetes, we can run them in, AWS Batch. And what we typically use for orchestrating all these batch jobs is Airflow. So a typical workflow could be, for example, you have some data in your data lake, could be, let's say, CSV files, right? And then you have some Python job that takes these CSV files and does something, puts them to, data warehouse, and then maybe you have a SQL job. You might use dbt or some other tools for that, and then you did some data preparation, and then maybe you run Spark, and then maybe you run again Python. All these steps are batch jobs. There we use different technologies, and for orchestrating this workflow, this pipeline, we use tools like Airflow. In this video, I also want to spend a bit of time talking about advantages of batch jobs. Batch jobs are pretty convenient. They are easy to manage, meaning that we have these workflow tools that let us define all the steps, then let us parameterize this script, let us easily retry this. So maybe I can also add this retry. So this workflow has a parameter that it's executed for a particular time interval, and then if something happens, we can just re-execute it. This is easy to manage. It's not happening in real time, that's why retrying is quite safe. And then it's also easier to scale. So for example, here, if something happens to our Python script, maybe there is a bigger file, we can just get a bigger machine. Or if something happens with our Spark, then maybe we get a bigger cluster or add more machines to the existing cluster. So this gives us this flexibility of scaling up and down things when we need to process things on the fly. In stream, then all these things become more difficult. And the main disadvantage here is delay, because we run things in regular intervals. Then we know if we want to see some data from the previous hour, we need to wait for 1 hour, and then this workflow executing this might take some time. For example, we need to have 5 minutes to execute this one, maybe another 5 minutes to execute this one, another 5 minutes to execute this one, and then maybe 3 minutes here, and then in total it's 20 minutes. And then it means that if we need some data from previous hour, so the hour is over, only now, when the hour is over, we can start executing this, and it will take 20 minutes to execute this, and only now the data is ready. It means that we will need to wait, let's say, 90 minutes before we can do something with the data that we saw at the beginning of the previous hour. And so this is the main disadvantage of batch processing, which you can solve with streaming, but oftentimes you actually don't need to react that fast. In many cases, it's fine to wait for 1 hour or for 1 day or even for 1 week before you can process the data and before you can put this data to some dashboard. There are some metrics that are not super time sensitive, and it's okay to wait 1 day before you can put this metric to your dashboard. The advantages we get from batch, they are pretty convenient. So that's why the majority of data processing jobs, at least in my company and in other companies where I worked, the majority, let's say 80%, if not more, they are in batch because of these advantages. Maybe this is misleading. I will move it to this slide. So let's say we have 80% of cases here and remaining 20, maybe even less, maybe 10% for streaming and 90% for batch. But I would say in my personal experience, most of the jobs that I saw, they are here. I probably convinced you by now that batch is important, and what we will do in the next video is we'll spend some time talking about this, because we already saw how to do batch transformations with SQL. In the previous week, we also touched a bit Python scripts in week 1. So here we will spend time talking about Spark. So see you soon.